Hopefully that little short introduction to torque showed you how to calculate torque. But what is the meaning of torque? I want to say a little bit about that. Torque happens anytime an object rotates. When my arm rotates, for instance, at my elbow right here, there's a torque that's being exerted on my arm by the muscles here. So torque, and that happens at every joint. Look at any joint that's bent, where you have something that bends, there's a torque that's acting in that case. There's a force, there's a distance from which that force is acting from the point of rotation. So you could calculate the torque that is associated with the bending of any part of your body. So it's a very useful and applicable quantity, because so much of the time when we're walking or doing any sort of a movement, we're seeing some sort of a bending at a joint. That involves a torque. So while forces are incredibly important, those are associated with objects moving or experiencing force in a given direction. Torque is associated with a force at right angles to the direction at which an object is moving. So that is a very prevalent quantity in the world that we'll see all the time. And there's two equations for torque. There's the one that was just mentioned in the previous slide, where it's equal to the force, the cross product is what this x refers to, of the force and the distance from the center of rotation that the force is acting. And those two, remember, have to be at right angles. That's what that x tells us, that those two have to be at right angles for maximum torque. So you have to have at least some component of force at right angles to the direction at which the object is being turned. I like to think of a wrench as a really good example of the application of torque. When you're pulling a wrench down, the wrench is at right angles to the direction of the force. If you're pushing the wrench against the bolt like this, or pulling it away from the bolt, you're not going to get any rotation of that bolt. So the torque is what causes the rotation, or allows for the rotation of a bolt. And for a bolt to rotate from not rotating, it has to undergo an angular acceleration. That's what this alpha represents here in this other equation for torque. The alpha represents how quickly the object's motion is changing, or how much it's angularly accelerating. The other quantity on the right over here is this I. That stands for something called the moment of inertia. And that tells you how easy it is to cause an object to spin. As an example, and that's a function not only of the mass of the object, but how that mass is distributed about the point at which the object's rotating. As an example, if you have a tire, a bike tire, you can get it to spin pretty quickly. But if you put a car tire on there and you try pulling it, rotating it, it's going to be a lot harder to get it to spin. It has a larger moment of inertia, primarily because it has a larger mass. And it's also, once you get those moments of inertia to start, or objects with big moments of inertia to start spinning, it's harder to stop them from spinning. So it's a lot like the concept of inertia we talked about much earlier in the semester, where tiny objects that have a small amount of mass, are really easy to accelerate, but larger objects are much more difficult to accelerate. They take much more force. For the case of rotating objects, it takes much more torque to accelerate objects that have a larger moment of inertia. The moment of inertia is also a function of how that mass is distributed. So as an example of how torque varies, not because of the mass alone, but how that mass is distributed relative to the point of rotation, I'm going to show you a demonstration right now. This is a meter stick with 500 gram mass on the end of it. I guess 550 if you count the mass hanger. Now 550 grams is maybe about a pound, a little over a pound. It's not a lot of mass, or not a lot of weight. But if I hold it on the end of a meter stick, it's a lot of effort for me to do that. It's really hard for me to do this, and I'm afraid the meter stick's going to break. There's a lot of torque being exerted here, because it's about 5 newtons multiplied by a meter, so it's 5 newton meters. It's not a lot of torque, but it's a fair bit, and it's hard for me to hold that up. But it's not impossible, but it takes me some effort, and my hand hurts because the meter stick is really digging into my hand right there. But if I hold it right here, I'm holding it at the 50 centimeter mark right here. It's much easier for me to do that, and I can accelerate it like that. From here, it's really hard for me to accelerate it. I can barely lift it up. I can, but it's really hard to do that. Here, it's much easier. You can have a much greater angular acceleration from here. And from here, of course, much easier still. Okay? So that is how the torque can be related to this quantity I times alpha. I is much bigger when the distance from the mass to the center of point of rotation is much bigger. Then you have a larger moment of inertia. Well, this quantity that we call torque is related to what we saw, I think, a couple labs ago when we're looking at leverage. When you're looking at a lever, I might have even been using a meter stick for that. And you have some things on one side and some things on the other of the meter stick, and you try to decide which way the meter stick is going to rotate. Well, the direction of rotation can be determined by which side has the greater torque. So torque is very significant in discussing leverage, which of course goes back centuries. And as Archimedes once stated, give me a place to stand and a lever long enough and I will move the world. Very famous quote that illustrates the power that you can attain with leverage. It's that same power that allows you to shift gears in your bike and climb a bike up a steep hill by adjusting to a really low gear. That's essentially, it's kind of like using a lever. You're exerting a small amount of force, but over a much bigger distance. And that allows you to move maybe a much smaller distance, but to apply much greater force. That is what you saw in lab a little while ago. And that is the concept of leverage. And so here's a problem I normally give in class using the clickers. So if you had to think about this, which direction would the object rotate, or would the seesaw rotate in this case? Would it rotate clockwise, or would it rotate counterclockwise? Clockwise, remember, is spinning in such a way that the hands of the clock would move. And if we're going to rotate in the clockwise direction, that small mass, the single red object here, would have to have the greater torque than the two red objects here. So this has half the mass of that. So at first glance, you might say, oh, that this is greater weight. It's going to turn counterclockwise. On the other hand, the distance here is 3 times the distance from here to here. So this 30 centimeter distance is the moment arm, the R in calculating the torque, which is F times R. And in this case, even though it's twice the force, the moment arm is only a third of it. So if you calculate the torque, let's just say the mass is M on the smaller side and 2M over here. The force then would be M times G, and the distance is 0.3 meters. So you'd have 0.3 mg on this side, and you'd have 0.1 times 2 mg, or 0.2 mg on this side. So the single mass is going to be the one that wins, and this system is going to rotate clockwise. And that's stated on the next slide, and we discussed why already. And basically, this is really what I already showed you. This is kind of like what you did in lab, where you could balance the ruler, and I could put a certain amount of mass a certain distance away from the center of mass of the ruler, which is where my finger is trying to balance it right here. And I could put that same amount of mass the same distance away on the other side, and the ruler would still remain in equilibrium. Now, if I doubled the mass on this side and I moved it to be 5 centimeters away instead of 10 centimeters away, the ruler would still remain in equilibrium. It would still be balanced because the torques would cancel out. Now, the units of torque can be a little bit deceiving or confusing because you have F cross R, or F times R. Force is the force associated with, let's say, pulling a wrench down, and the R is the distance from the point of rotation to the point at which the force is being applied. If those two are at right angles, then you get the maximum torque. That's what that X in the middle says, and that's what I stated in a previous video. If they're not at right angles, then you will get less torque. And a matter of fact, if they're lined up, if you're pushing on the wrench to try to loosen a bolt, or if you're pulling on the wrench, the wrench is just going to come off the bolt. You're not going to get any torque at all. So there has to be some force directed at right angles to the wrench in order to get the bolt to turn either clockwise or counterclockwise. And as I mentioned to some of you, I practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, or at least I used to before the COVID shutdown. Don't know when I'll be doing that again. But in any case, this is an example of two of my friends who were practicing, who are both pretty big. I think one of them weighs, they both weigh at least 240 pounds. So between the two of them, they're 500 pounds, a quarter ton. And they're balancing on this one guy's legs there because the other guy's trying to pull him this way to get him to roll forward, and he's trying to pull back so that he doesn't roll forward. And they were remaining in that balance for about 30 seconds, and I just couldn't resist taking their picture and telling them I'd use it in my class. This was a couple years ago. And I'll tell you a little bit more about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in a few minutes, but torque and leverage are completely vital to application of most martial arts, but certainly Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is a lot like wrestling. In the end, it's similar in many ways, except unlike in wrestling, you're actually trying to get the other person to tap out because you've got them in a position that's very compromising for them, where they either are being choked or perhaps are going to break a limb, which involves using leverage in order for that to happen. So here's just an example of how you could calculate the torque. What is the torque caused by the 3 kilogram mass located at the end of the rod? And the rod can pivot from this one end over here. And it has a 3 kilogram mass. We're going to ignore the mass of the rod itself. And so what I would do is I determine the force associated with 3 kilogram mass, multiply that mass times G, and I have a force of 30 newtons. That's pulling down. 2 meter length, so the torque would be 60 Newton meters, which is significant. If you remember how hard a time I had with 5 Newton meters trying to lift something up, try 60 Newton meters. This would be really tough to do. But it's only a 3 kilogram mass, you say. Try it. Now, in this case, it would be a little bit easier. It would be just a 1 meter distance that the 3 kilogram mass was located from the point of rotation. So the torque on this case would be 30 newtons times 1 meter, or 30 Newton meters, or half of what it was previously. I want to conclude the talk on torque with just a couple questions. One is to think about this question, which I would have asked as a clicker question if this were class. Can an object spin if it has no net torque acting on it? And I want you to think, as you consider this problem, think of torque as the rotational equivalent of force. And so the equivalent question for force would be, can an object move if it has no net force acting on it? So thinking of spinning as kind of like motion, and torque is kind of like force, at least metaphorically or analogically. So if you consider that question, if there's no net torque on an object, yes, it can spin. It's just that its spin can't change. So the external torque is what's needed to cause the spin to change, whether increasing its rate of spin or decreasing its rate of spin. But it can spin without torque. And I want to show you one last video on Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's only 15 seconds long or so, but you can see me doing a little bit of rolling with my son. I visited October in Arizona and went to his studio. We're rolling no-gi right now. If you can see where torque and leverage are coming into play here, constantly. It's only 15 seconds, but you get the idea, hopefully.